This story is from the manuscript of Ahmed ibn Fadlan, and the Russians are reckless with wine, drinking it night and day, and perhaps one of them dies with a cup in his hand. And when their leader dies, his family says to his maids and servants, "Which of you will die with him?" Then someone of them says, "I am." If he says that, then it is obligatory for him, and it is not possible for him to ever cancel his decision. If he wanted to, he could not do it, and most of the slave girls do this. When that man I mentioned died, they said to his maids, "Who will die with him?" One of them said, "I am." So they assigned her to two maids who could protect her and be with her wherever she went. And they might even wash her feet with their own hands. And they would take care of their dead man, cut clothes for him, and handle what he needed. And the maid would drink and sing with joy every day. When the day came on which he and the maid were to be burnt, I came to the river where his ship was brought out. They made four corners for the ship of Kadanak wood and other things, and around it they also made something like large pillars of wood. They placed them on that wood, and they began coming and going and talking with words that I do not understand, while the man was still in his grave, because they did not dig him out. Then they brought a bed, put it on the ship, and covered it with Roman brocade curtains and Roman brocade backings. Then an old woman came, and they called her the Angel of Death. So she spread the mattresses I mentioned on the bed, and she took charge of sewing and mending them. As she was in charge of killing the slave girls, and I saw her as a young, huge, gloved woman. When they came to his grave, they took the dust off the wood and took out the wood. And they took him out in the garment in which he died. And I saw that he had turned black due to the cold of the country. They had put with him wine, fruit, and a timber in his grave. So they took all of that out, and nothing did stink or change except color. So they dressed him in trousers, slippers, a kurta, a brocade slippers with gold buttons, and they put a sable brocade cap on his head. And they carried him until they brought him into the dome that was on the ship. And they made him sit on the platform and supported him with supports. They brought wine, fruit, and basil, which they placed with him. And they brought bread, meat, and onions, and threw them before him. Then they brought a dog, cut it in two, and threw it into the ship. And they brought all of his weapons, and put them on his side. Then they took two animals, and dragged them, until they became sweaty. Then they cut them with a sword, and threw their meat into the ship. Then they brought two cows, cut them up, and threw them into it. And they brought a rooster and a hen, killed them, and threw them into it. And the slave girl who chose to be killed was going and coming, entering each one of their domes, and each dome owner intercoursed with her and said to her, "Tell your master, I did this out of love for you." When it was afternoon time on Friday, they brought the slave girl to something they had made like a door opener. So she placed her feet on the hands of the man, got on that door opener, and spoke something of her own. So they put her down, then they brought her up again, and she did the same as she did the first time. Then they took her down, and brought her up a third time. And then they brought a chicken to her, so she cut off its head and threw it away, and they took the chicken and threw it into the ship. So I asked the translator about her action, and he said, "The first time they brought her up, she said, 'Behold, I see my father and my mother.' She said the second time, 'Behold, I see all my dead relatives sitting.' She said the third time, 'Behold, I see my master sitting in paradise, and paradise is beautiful and green, and with him are men and boys, and he is calling me. So send me to him.' And then they passed her towards the ship. And she took off 2 bracelets that were on her, and gave them to the woman who is called the Angel of Death. And she was the one who would kill her. Then she took off 2 anklets that were on her, and gave them to the 2 maids who were serving her. And they were the daughters of the woman known as the Angel of Death. Then they boarded her on the ship, but did not let her into the dome. Then the men came with shields and wood, and gave her a cup of wine. So she sang over it, and drank it. And the translator told me, she is bidding farewell to her companions. Then another cup was given to her, so she took it and sang for a long time. And the old woman urged her to drink it, and entered the dome where her master was. And the slave girl became dull and wanted to enter the dome. So she stuck her head between the dome and the ship. So the old woman took her head, brought her into the dome, and entered with her. And the men began to beat with the wood on the shields, so that the sound of her cries would not be heard, and frighten the other girls, and make them give up dying with their masters. Then 6 men entered the dome, and had sexual intercourse with the slave girl. Then they laid her down next to her master. 2 of them held her legs, and 2 held her hands. The old woman, who is called the Angel of Death, put a rope around her neck, and made 2 of them hold the rope to pull it. Then she brought a broad-bladed dagger, and she started inserting it between her ribs, place by place. And the 2 men kept strangling her with the rope until she died. Then came one of the closest people to that dead person, who took a log and lit it with fire. Then the man walked backwards towards the back of the ship, facing the people, with the burning log in one hand, and his other hand on the door of his deck, while he was naked. And he burnt the packed wood that was under the ship, after they put the slave girl, who they killed, next to her master. Then he brought some wood to the people, and gave everyone a piece of wood that had been ignited, so that they would throw them on the wood. The fire spread in the wood, then in the ship, then in the dome, and the dead man, and the slave girl, and all that was in it. Then a great, tremendous wind blew, and the flame of the fire intensified and became hot. A Russian man was next to me, and I heard him talking to the translator who was with me, so I asked him what he said to him, and he said, "He says, 'You Arabs are fools.' So I said, 'Why is that?' He said, 'You take the dearest and most honorable to you, and you throw him into the soil, and the soil, vermin, and worms eat him. But we burn him with fire in an instant, then he enters paradise immediately at the time of his death.' Then he laughed excessively, so I asked about that, and he said, 'Because of his Lord's love for him, he sent the wind so that it would take him away in an hour. In fact, not even an hour had passed before the ship, the wood, the slave girl, and the master were reduced to ashes. Then they built on the place of the ship, which they had taken out of the river, something resembling a round hill. And they set up a large plank of wood in the middle of it, and wrote on it the name of the man and the name of the king of the Russians, and they left.